Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Mike Holman, SVP and Group Director here at Lux Research, and very excited to be moderating a webinar on the very timely topic of the impact of inflation on consumer desire for sustainability. Presenter today is my colleague, Ujwal Arkalgund, who's the EVP and Group Director here at Lux Research and founder of MotiveBase. So if you have any questions during the webinar, there's a questions box on the screen. You can type those in. We'll answer as many questions as we have time to get to at the end. But if your question doesn't get answered or you think of another one afterwards, feel free to email us at questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. So with that, let's turn things over to Ujwal and get rolling.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. For those of you who had signed up for this webinar a little bit earlier, you may have noticed that there's a change in title. And no, you are not showing up for the wrong webinar. You're showing up for the right one. We intended to study the changing meaning of sustainability when it comes to household products, consumer packaged goods. As we got into that culture and began studying it, we realized that the impact of inflation was so significant on consumer discourse that it was almost impossible to ignore. And in fact, I'll go as far to say that it had become such an issue that it had actually reversed the tide on some of the motivations and value systems that we were really seeing around consumer desire or desirability of sustainable solutions. So that's in essence the central focus of our session today. Fundamentally, I'll begin with this statement. We're all used to kind of talking about consumers wanting to make the right choice, consumers needing help to make the sustainable choice. What the inflationary environment has done is it's kind of flipped that on its head a little bit, where we now exist in an environment where consumers are looking for a reason not to make the sustainable choice. That's a bit of a switch. And specifically, and I'll talk a little bit further about how we got there, but specifically, inflation is really what is responsible for this change in the consumer psyche. And there are, in particular, four barriers, or rather four excuses, if you can call them that are really coming in the way of consumers being able to make a sustainable choice, find a sustainable alternative, run some experiments in their households, try new products out. So that's what we're going to spend our time really focusing on today: accessibility, trust, harm reduction, and waste. And no, none of these titles, by the way, mean exactly what you were thinking of, and we'll define them clearly and explain why. But before we do that, I just want to explain to you how we got here. And for those of you who have not attended one of our previous webinars, at MotiveBase, we're all anthropologists, and as anthropologists, our primary preoccupation is the study of meaning. And more specifically, it's the study of the implicit side of the meaning equation. What I mean by that is the stuff that we can't ask consumers, other human beings about. We can't just say, hey, what does sustainability mean to you, and have them give us those responses. That's why those are implied meanings. The way we get at them is by studying the natural structure of language within the context of sustainability. This is what structural anthropology is all about. It basically says that if we want to understand how humans assign meaning to something, all we have to study is the natural ways in which humans talk about that something. Because the natural ways in which we talk about something reveals breadcrumbs of insight, critical, implicit meaning that helps us understand not just where something sits today in the consumer psyche, but where it's headed tomorrow. And to illustrate that, I'll use this sort of simplified example. On your screen, you're looking at the explicit associations, so the explicit meanings around food in the context of food. Meanings like indulgence, nutrition, sustainability, diet, all things we're used to seeing, all things you could ask a consumer about, and you're going to get those logical responses. But here's the problem. Lying beneath the surface is really the opportunities, the critical insight. And the only way to do that is by looking at the full contextual picture. Because what data science tends to do is say, hey, nutrition deficiency is a hop away, so I'm going to give it less value. What anthropology says is, no, it doesn't matter how many hops away something is. What matters is it within the contextual boundary? If it's within the contextual boundary, we need to not discriminate against those implicit relationships, but rather consider them and give them equal proportion, equal weight, and then really determine whether the nature of the relationship between food and a topic like sleep, for example, at the top right of your screen, whether that relationship is slowly strengthening with time. So that's fundamentally, I'm kind of giving you a 2-minute crash course on structural anthropology, but that's fundamentally what it does. And it allows us to identify these systems of meaning that are actually mediating the relationship, enabling the relationship between food and nutrition. Without the right side of the equation, you do what everybody else is doing. When you understand the right side of this equation, you realize exactly what the problem is that you need to solve, specifically about nutritional deficiency, certain kinds of micronutrients. You're realizing, oh, people connect it to sleep or to metabolic energy and so on and so forth. That's really what we do. So when we examine the broader context discourse around sustainability, but specific to the context of sort of household products, consumer packaged goods, we discovered that a lot of the systems of meaning had the issue of inflation kind of sort of peppered throughout. And that's what fundamentally helped us realize that inflation has become an issue, and then allowed us to then dive into those systems of meaning to really figure out what kind of issue has it become really, how is it affecting the consumer psyche and potentially preventing them from making the sustainable choice. So before we get into it, I want to do a quick level set. Where does sustainability sit today in the overall landscape of CPG? First and foremost, don't believe what the media is telling you, right? The media talks about sustainability as if it is a mainstream trend. It is far from being of mainstream relevancy. I think all of us know this. If we work in innovation, we certainly know this. Today, it has relevancy to about 20 million Americans. It's growing quite heavily, and it's not in mainstream, but it's still in early consensus, but it's certainly slowly but surely inching its way there. So overall, the picture is a positive one. So despite the inflationary environment, I want to start with the positive side of the picture, which is, and maybe this is also a call out to all R&D and innovation folks, to not do what we sort of did in 2020 when the climate began to change, right? It's important to remember that just because we're in an inflationary and potential recessionary environment does not mean we stop investing in sustainable innovations, because clearly the culture of innovation is still, the culture of sustainability is still evolving. The interest, the desirability of sustainable solutions is still very much growing in the context of CPG. So let's begin with that as a level set. But here's the challenge. Inflation has now brought on certain barriers that we need to solve for. And we're going to now take you through 4 of those critical barriers, all of which present opportunities for innovation, in particular for product development. And I'll explain why that's the case. Because we could very easily look at some of these barriers and go, no, this is a downstream problem. This is a problem for marketing and brand to solve. But that would be a big mistake. And I'll explain why. And let's begin with the very first barrier, the need for accessibility. What does this mean? There are really 4 elements here that make up the consumer psyche. The first one comes down to the simple notion of experimentation and availability. Consumers, when they want to make a sustainable choice, they want to feel like it's easy to experiment. What does that mean? People go and try a new product out. They're experimenting with a new product. They're trying to figure out, is this new product going to work in my household? So the 2 requirements is ease of experimentation and ease of access. If this thing works for me, can I find it again and again? Can I make this a regular part of my lifestyle? The issue we have on our hands is that from the consumer's perspective, especially in this inflationary environment, there is a barrier to experimentation and availability when it comes to sustainable solutions. People are believing that it's harder to run an experiment because my wallet's tighter. And secondly, even if I run an experiment and find something that works for me, I'm not going to be able to repeat the exercise or find or access these products more regularly. Now, related to this is also this issue of privilege. Sustainable solutions run a huge risk right now in our current environment of becoming something for the haves only, not for the have-nots. And that's a huge problem. As you all know, I'm sure, we live in an environment where the desire to not be seen as sort of privileged is perhaps even stronger than the desire to make a sustainable impact on the future of the universe. Privilege is a huge, huge issue. And we certainly, and again, you might think this is an issue on the brand side. It is not, because ultimately, privilege is determined by, the quantities of product we can make, how we can price these products, which then is determined by what kinds of ingredients we source and the availability of those ingredients, and so on and so forth. So we really have to begin thinking about these issues at the top of that food chain, not at the bottom of that. And this is the challenge we all have to solve. And then the last piece is, of course, efficacy. And I'll come to that in the next barrier and talk a bit more about that. But the ongoing challenge, of course, with something becoming a privilege is that the more it becomes a privilege, the greater the expectation then is on how efficacious that product needs to be. And we all know the moment we think about a sustainable alternative, we think about sort of the balancing act between efficacy and sustainability. And that sort of goes against how consumer expectations are shaping and forming in this space. So this is the challenge we all have to solve. I think the big takeaway is we're running the risk of sustainable solutions becoming an issue of privilege. And if it's becoming an issue of privilege, then the expectation on the efficacy of the product is even higher than it was before, making the barrier even more significant for us in terms of being able to create desirability around the new solutions we're launching. A couple of other things to note. You'll notice key consumer, Latin American, African American consumers. What I mean by that is these cohorts are over-indexing national averages when it comes to these barriers. So it's something important to consider as we enter a space where all major brands, all major organizations are trying to figure out how do we bring solutions that are more accessible, how do we bring solutions that are better suited to African American and Latinx consumers in the United States, and of course more diverse audiences globally. So this is an important issue fundamentally that we all need to think about. Now, this issue vis-a-vis the macro culture of sustainability sits in early consensus, and it is still driving onward pressure, right? So this is one of those scenarios where what we're really showing you here is where each of these microcultures sit vis-a-vis their macrocultures. And I'll put everything together towards the end to help you prioritize which of these barriers you should sort of begin to address first, and then slowly move down the chain. But fundamentally, what's important to realize is that within the macro universe of sustainability, this is still occupying a fairly heavy position at 6.7% in maturity and relevant to about 12.5 million people. Let's go to the next barrier, the need for trust. This is another really interesting issue that's developing. And really, the big issue here is actually this issue around impact on efficacy. And as I'd mentioned in the previous barrier, we're going to dive into efficacy a bit more here. Why is that the case? Because the consumer believes that somehow they're treated like they're not smart enough to understand the sort of balancing act between efficacy and sustainability. And in essence, what the consumer is saying is, we understand that when you make a product more sustainable, there are certain sort of negative impacts that's going to have potentially on efficacy. There are certain areas that we're going to have to make a compromise on. Let's figure out what those areas are. Let's be open about them, and let's figure out how we can solve them. This is why this is an issue of trust, because they feel like organizations do not treat them in a way that allows them to build that trust, because in most cases, these products are marketed as if they're just as good as the other incumbents, and consumers obviously have different experiences when they actually use them. So there's a trust challenge as well that is developing here. A couple of other issues that relate here is shelf life. The consumer expects a sustainable product to have less shelf life. There's an expectation that freshness is a topic that should be discussed here. Again, not really addressed. And again, an important critical aspect, especially on the R&D side, as we think about how we're evolving formulations, how we're thinking about potentially packaging as a way to solve for the freshness problem. The other thing that is also interesting to note here is this notion of less active. There's a perception in the marketplace that sustainability potentially limits our use of active ingredients. And this in particular shows up in places like cleaning, or categories like cleaning, categories like skincare, categories like hygiene. Again, I can't as an anthropologist, I can't speak to whether that is technically correct or not. What I can speak to is the fact that this is a perceptual frame that is developing in the mind of the consumer. Again, something that we need to consider um, at the top of the innovation life cycle so that we can understand how we can begin to address some of these barriers head on. This one, unlike the previous microculture, is much further back. So the relevancy of this issue of trust is even further back. And of course, we run the risk of saying, oh, this is in the new ideas phase. Why even bother? And we certainly would never recommend doing that, because the whole point of identifying these barriers early on is so that we're never caught off guard, right? We can then track and understand how these are evolving with time and then take the appropriate action early on, especially knowing that a lot of us operate in environments where our innovation life cycles are not 12 months. They're 2 to 4 years if we're lucky. So we always have to think ahead in these environments. Let's go to number 3, waste. But here's the critical piece here. Especially the last couple of years, we talked extensively about waste being an issue on the consumer side. What can you do as a consumer to tackle the issue of waste? What we're seeing now is the consumer lobbing it back over to the manufacturer saying, hey, no, this is going to be a manufacturer issue in 2023 because I've got other challenges to deal with. And specifically, there are 2 areas that come up that are very interesting. One is the area of product design. The consumer is looking at the area of product design and saying, hey, there's a lack of improvement in actual product design. There's a lot of focus on packaging because, of course, it's sort of an easy narrative for organizations to tell the story of reduction of use of virgin plastics or use of post-recycled post-recycled materials or plastics and so on. But what's interesting is the consumer saying, hey, you're doing all of this, spending all of this energy on the packaging side. What are you doing to actually improve the design of the product itself so that it requires, for example, less use of water, potentially requires or enables the reuse of the pack itself and makes a refillable pack and so on and so forth. These are, of course, very obvious examples that consumers talk about because these are experiences they have day to day. But of course, the sky's the limit when we put that into the lens of innovation and R&D, into the lens of design thinking. There's a lot of opportunities opening up here, but the consumer is starting to ask those questions, and I think the challenge is lobbed back to us in corporate innovation to say, what are we going to do about it? Now, related to this, of course, is also the consumer calling us out for wasteful, what the consumer calls wasteful business models. Hey, why are you selling me 3 products when just one would have sufficed, right? Do I really need 3 cleaners for my kitchen, or will one just do the job all over all over my kitchen, whether it's one surface or the other? I think these are the interesting questions that we have to start to tackle head on, both from an innovation standpoint and from sort of a product design packaging standpoint. And I think the more we can start to do that early on, the more we increase the desirability of sustainable solutions, the more we reduce the barriers to adopting sustainable solutions. And we kind of, I hate I need a better analogy than kill 2 birds with 1 stone, because that's way too aggressive for my liking, but you get the point. It's about solving multiple problems by taking a singular approach and realizing that the consumer is connecting the dots between these issues in a much smarter way than I think many of us give the consumer credit for. This culture, quite further along, relevant to 16 million people, will be relevant to 18 million people in the short term. In early consensus, a fairly healthy amount of growth, outward pressure on the demand for sustainability, and interest is developing among Caucasian, African American, and Asian American consumers here. And then the harm reduction issue. It's the last one of the 4. Harm reduction. Why do we call it harm reduction? Because, of course, depending on what industry we're in, we've all seen sort of this movement towards naturals, if you can call it that, right? Movement towards wanting to reduce harm. What's interesting here is harm reduction is put into sort of a much broader lens of not just harming the planet, harming human health, but also harming animal health. So it's about animal testing, but it's also about reducing our reliance on animal-derived ingredients. But here's the kicker. The consumer is asking, hey, if we reduce our reliance on animal-derived ingredients because we're making them sustainable, um, is that always the case? Is a reduced reliance on animal-derived ingredients always a more sustainable choice? And they use some interesting examples like gelatin, wool, and there are many others, I'm sure, but these are two that come up among consumers discussing these issues, saying, aren't these examples of sort of animal byproducts that are actually better to be used because of other practices that exist anyway? Um, would changing out the incumbent actually make us more sustainable? I think these are some pretty profound, interesting questions being asked. And I think this is showing us that the more we try to throw blanketed frameworks at consumers, the more we're going to increase these barriers, right? The consumer is showing us that there's a nuanced understanding that's developing in the landscape, and we have to acknowledge these nuances and find solutions against these nuances. Another one is on the chemical side, with consumers asking, are sustainable chemicals also the safest for the body? This is another very interesting question, which is, does sustainability automatically equal less harm? The consumer isn't sure. And I think this is why these are amazing R&D challenges that all of us need to think about. Again, in early consensus, yes, not as big as the previous barrier, but growing by 25% in the short term, exerting outward pressure on the desirability for sustainability. So what happens when we put all of this together? So just going back to our overall macro landscape of sustainability, we began by saying, look, despite the inflationary environment, the desire for sustainability is still very much growing, right? And it's growing in the short term. It's going to be relevant to almost 30 million people. This is not going away, but there are some there are some headwinds that we need to tackle. And in particular, 3 out of the 4 headwinds that we talked about, we should be tackling now, especially when we're putting this into the lens of R&D and innovation, because we don't have the luxury of innovating in 6 months. We need time and we need energy to be able to put into these solutions to actually bring them to life in a way that is beneficial to the organization, beneficial to humanity, allows us to meet our sustainable goals and, of course, our business goals overall. And this is, in essence, the cadence that we're now that the consumer is now demonstrating or indicating for us, right? Begin with the issue of waste, but remember, this is an issue or the consumer's throwing the gauntlet down and saying, hey, here's my challenge to you, manufacturer, brand. How are you going to make this an issue of product design and product experience? How are you going to solve the waste problem with smart product design? How are you going to demonstrate to me that you're achieving that? Second one, harm reduction. We just talked about that in terms of the consumer asking, does your sustainability goal also go hand in hand with harm reduction? I'm not sure. Does the sustainable chemical equal less harm, or is it actually more harmful for my skin, for my body? Again, there's gaps in knowledge. There's also opportunities. And then, of course, we talked about the issue of access. We began with that as a really interesting risk that sustainability is getting pulled into this sort of privilege argument. We do not want that if we want to achieve our goals ultimately. So what are some of the key takeaways? Waste reduction at every stage. Consider ingredients, processes, business models that cut waste. Use the product to take the stress away from the consumer. This is the key. Use the product, not marketing. Use the product to take the stress away from the consumer. In an inflationary environment, the more we can do this, the more we reduce these barriers and continue on the journey, so that as people settle into the new economic normal and the desire for sustainability reinvigorates and continues to progress, you are not sitting there going, hey, we just lost 12 months. And instead of innovating and being at the top of that, leading the charge, here we are, behind, and now we have to fight, 10 other new challengers that are all, micro brands and independent companies that are sort of really driving innovation in the landscape. So this is what I mean by let's not do what we did in 2020, especially for a lot of us who enjoyed sales growth in 2020. Let's not do what we did in 2020, assuming that it's going to be the new normal. Ultimately, as anthropologists, this is why we do this type of work, to help you understand how beliefs are changing so that we don't get distracted by shiny object syndrome and always keep our eyes on the ultimate prize, which is that the desire for sustainability continues to grow despite inflationary pressures, inflationary headwinds. What we have to do is be smart about how to tackle those headwinds. Okay, coming back to our list, key takeaway number 2, harm reduction. Choose sustainable chemicals, materials that minimize harm to skin, health, home, even animals. Again, we have to prove this to the consumer. We have to demonstrate what kind of impact this can have, how it actually reduces harm versus the incumbent. And then lastly, access. Focus on identifying sustainable solutions that have minimal impact on efficacy. Consider product design solutions to bridge gaps. And do not shy away from educating the consumer about what compromise they're making on the efficacy side. Consumers do not want to feel stupid when they make these decisions. This is critical. Thank you. This is what I really wanted to leave you with today, is to help you understand that, if there are 2 major takeaways I'd like you to keep in mind here. One is, despite the headwinds, the desire for sustainability in CPG is not going away. Second, within the context of CPG, we have to tackle these headwinds if we want to think about the future of sustainable innovations in whatever categories we operate in. And these are, some, let's say, thought starters to get you thinking in the right direction, to help you have the right conversations internally, and to help you realize really where the pressures are going to lie from the consumer's perspective. Mike, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ujwal. It's a really thought-provoking presentation, and we've got some questions here already. Again, as you have more, feel free to type those into the questions box. If we don't get to yours on the call, we will follow up after the webinar. A couple of things here related to something I know we heard about from our clients a lot, which is the concern about the consumers. This goes to your accessibility and privilege issue, right? The concern about the willingness of consumers to pay a premium for a sustainability product. And it's something we have been over the last few years seeing to some degree. So from the data that you're seeing, does that just go away, or is that significantly reduced in the near term? How should marketers and product developers be thinking about that pricing impact?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the big takeaway is, if the price rises, the expectation of efficacy also rises, right? So that was the big takeaway from the analysis on privilege and access. And if there's a compromise on efficacy, then we can't afford to offer a higher price point. That's the challenge we're going to have to deal with, especially in 2023. That might soften again in 24 as people settle in, but that's going to be the challenge that we all have to deal with.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really stuck out for me is that comment about consumers looking for an excuse not to make the sustainable choice. But there's also a question following, like, how do you respond to that and try to take advantage of it, right? So it's not just a matter of up to marketing to solve, as you said, but how do you see folks between R&D and marketing working together the most effectively? Are there successful examples of that you've seen? What is going to make that work, since we do need both sides?
You know what? Whoever asked that question, that's a phenomenal question, and I think it is obviously a very hard question to answer in a couple of minutes. But here's what I will say. I think there's never been a more critical time than now for downstream teams to work with upstream teams. I think it's absolutely critical, because we are more and more realizing, right? You take an issue like harm reduction. We're realizing that we can't just add marketing and expect it to solve a problem. Consumers are very quick at judging the authenticity of the claim, right? Even if you meet regulatory requirements, consumers don't care about regulation. They care about what they think is authentic to them. and solving their problems and their jobs. So that's the one piece. The second piece is as consumer expectations are evolving in the inflationary environment, there's a real opportunity for us to connect the dots between what can be authentically talked about in marketing and what we can authentically offer in product. And I think the more we start having those cross-functional collaborative discussions and outcomes, the better prepared we're going to be to tackle these problems head on. You know, and Mike, you certainly have expertise in areas like these, and feel free to jump in here. But you know, there's so many examples of situations where an R&D exec has a choice to make between, let's say, two ingredients. One potentially that offers a more efficacious outcome, but slightly less sustainable outcome. The other, the opposite. How do you make that choice? And what kind of impact will that have in the stories being told downstream? And how can we make those decisions collaboratively across these cross-functional teams? I think these are going to be the most critical types of decisions that we need to be making across the board. And I think as we make them, we need to examine some of these emerging barriers to really understand how that might play a role in potentially preventing our ability to attract a new customer who's unwilling to do a trial in 2023 because of some of these barriers.
Well, yeah, and the last thing you want to do is to be sort of dragged into that whole greenwashing conversation or narrative where consumers feel like you're making claims that aren't justified based on the product. I do think that's about all we have time for in terms of questions today. So thanks very much again, Ujwal, for a great presentation. For the attendees, the slide presentation and recording will be sent around via email today or tomorrow. After you leave the webinar, you will get a prompt to complete a survey about the presentation. Please take a moment or so to do that. We would really appreciate it, and we really do look at that feedback and try to use it to improve our future webinars. So thanks so much for everyone for joining today. Thanks again to Ujwal for the presentation, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks all.